Just the hired wedding server they all treated like invisible help and looked down on, until armed kidnappers crashed the millionaire's daughter's wedding and discovered that David Rodriguez was a Green Beret who had eliminated terrorist cells across 3 countries and would die before letting harm come to innocent people. It was 7:30 p.m. on a perfect Saturday evening at the grand ballroom of the Chateau Marmont Resort in Aspen, Colorado, and everything about Victoria Pemberton's wedding had been designed to showcase the kind of wealth and privilege that most people only saw in magazines. The reception was in full swing, with 300 guests celebrating in a venue that cost more per night than most people earned in a year. Crystal chandeliers cast perfect light on tables adorned with flowers that had been flown in from 3 different countries, while a 12-piece orchestra played classical arrangements that had been specially commissioned for the occasion. The bride's father, Robert Pemberton III, was the CEO of Pemberton Industries, a multinational corporation with interests in oil, mining, and defense contracting that generated billions in annual revenue. The groom's family owned a chain of luxury hotels that catered to European royalty and Hollywood celebrities. This wasn't just a wedding. It was a merger of 2 financial empires, celebrated with the kind of extravagance that made statements about power, status, and the comfortable assumption that some people were simply born to live above the concerns of ordinary mortals. Moving almost invisibly through this world of designer gowns and custom tuxedos was a man who had become as unremarkable as the gold-plated serving trays and imported champagne that marked the evening's celebration. David Rodriguez, 34, carried his serving tray through the ballroom with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to make himself unnoticed, while working in spaces where his presence was required, but his humanity was optional. To the wedding guests, investment bankers, corporate executives, trust fund heirs, and European nobility, David was simply the help, a Hispanic man in a black uniform who refilled their wine glasses and cleared their plates without bothering them with unnecessary eye contact or conversation. His catering uniform was provided by the event company and fit him well enough. But everything about his appearance suggested someone who worked for hourly wages and was grateful for whatever employment he could find in the rarefied world of luxury hospitality. His polished black shoes were comfortable, but showed the wear of someone who spent long hours on his feet, and his movements had the careful precision of a professional server who understood that a single mistake, a spilled drink on a designer dress, a misplaced appetizer tray, could cost him his job and his reputation in an industry where word of mouth determined future employment opportunities. When the wedding guests looked at David, which they rarely did, they saw exactly what their assumptions told them to see: an immigrant worker, probably grateful for the opportunity to work an event where the tips alone might equal a week's wages at a regular job. Certainly not someone whose opinions or experiences could possibly be relevant to their sophisticated social gathering. They spoke around him and over him, discussing business deals worth millions of dollars and vacation plans that cost more than most people's annual salaries, occasionally offering the kind of polite but distant acknowledgement you might give to any service worker whose name you've never bothered to learn. Richard Pemberton Jr., the bride's uncle, and a senior partner at one of New York's most prestigious investment firms, was particularly dismissive in his interactions with the catering staff. A Harvard Business School graduate with a trust fund that had allowed him to purchase a congressional seat through strategic campaign contributions, Pemberton carried himself with the casual arrogance of someone who had never learned to question his own assumptions about superiority, intelligence, and worth. To him, David was simply part of the event's infrastructure, useful for keeping the champagne flowing and the hors d'oeuvres circulating, but certainly not someone whose input would ever be valued in any meaningful context. "Make sure the help keeps the drinks coming," Pemberton said to the catering manager, not bothering to lower his voice even though David was standing less than 10 feet away. "At what we're paying for this event, the service should be invisible and perfect. I don't want to see empty glasses or hear any complaints from the guests about slow service." If Richard Pemberton had possessed even a fraction of the wisdom that should have come with his expensive education, he might have noticed things about David Rodriguez that didn't quite fit his assumptions about service workers and social hierarchy. He might have observed the way David's eyes automatically scanned exits and assessed potential security vulnerabilities as he moved through the ballroom. He might have wondered why a catering server seemed to understand crowd dynamics and threat assessment with the kind of situational awareness that went far beyond hospitality training. He might have questioned why someone who was supposedly limited to serving drinks and clearing plates moved with the kind of controlled, economical grace that suggested extensive physical training and combat experience. But Richard Pemberton, like most of his social class, had never learned to look beyond the surface of people who didn't share his background or economic status. What none of them knew, what David Rodriguez had never told anyone during his 2 years of working high-end catering events in Colorado's luxury resort towns, was that those same hands that now carried serving trays and poured wine had once handled weapons with deadly precision in the mountains of Afghanistan and the deserts of Syria. Those eyes that seemed focused on mundane hospitality tasks had once scanned hostile terrain for threats that could kill him and the special forces operators under his command. That mind that appeared suited only for simple service work had once planned and executed direct action raids against high-value targets in some of the most dangerous locations on Earth. David Rodriguez wasn't just any veteran. He was former Staff Sergeant David Rodriguez, United States Army Special Forces, 1st Special Forces Group, Airborne, with 4 combat deployments to Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria, and a chest full of commendations that included a Silver Star for gallantry in action against enemy forces. For 10 years, he had been a Green Beret, one of the most elite and versatile soldiers in the American military, trained not just in conventional warfare, but in unconventional operations, foreign internal defense, special reconnaissance, and direct action missions that required skills ranging from advanced marksmanship to foreign languages to cultural intelligence. David had been the kind of special forces operator that other elite soldiers respected and enemy combatants feared, a warrior who could operate independently behind enemy lines for weeks at a time, who spoke 3 languages fluently and could blend into local populations while gathering intelligence that saved American lives. He had planned and executed raids on terrorist compounds where split-second decisions meant the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. He had trained foreign military units in counterterrorism techniques, conducted special reconnaissance in hostile territory, and eliminated high-value targets with the kind of precision that required not just physical skills, but psychological preparation for taking human lives in service of larger strategic objectives. His call sign, Shadow, hadn't come from his ability to remain undetected, though that was considerable. It had come from his uncanny ability to anticipate enemy movements and position himself where he could observe, assess, and eliminate threats before they materialized. His fellow operators swore that David Rodriguez could read a tactical situation better than most officers with twice his experience. But the truth was simpler and more impressive. He had trained his mind to process enormous amounts of environmental and behavioral data while making accurate predictions about human nature under extreme stress. But that was before the IED explosion outside Aleppo in 2020 that had ended his military career in a blast of shrapnel and concussive force that left him with traumatic brain injury, chronic pain from nerve damage, and the kind of invisible wounds that made civilian employers nervous about hiring damaged veterans who might be unstable or unreliable. The Army had given him a medical retirement, a disability rating that provided barely enough to survive, and thanked him for his service before sending him back to a civilian world that didn't know what to do with former Special Forces operators whose skills had been honed for situations that most Americans preferred not to think about. So David Rodriguez, who had once been trusted with the most sensitive and dangerous missions the military could devise, found himself serving champagne and clearing dinner plates, invisible to the very people whose freedom and security his sacrifices had helped preserve. On this particular Saturday evening, As David moved through the grand ballroom, ensuring that Victoria Pemberton's wedding reception proceeded with the flawless elegance that extreme wealth could purchase, his trained senses picked up something that immediately triggered every threat assessment protocol he had learned during 10 years of special operations. It wasn't anything obvious. No visible weapons, no overtly suspicious behavior, but rather a pattern of subtle indicators that his combat-trained mind recognized as the preliminary stages of a coordinated hostile operation. 3 men had arrived at the reception, claiming to be last-minute guests from the groom's side of the family, but their body language, positioning, and movement patterns suggested something far more sinister. They weren't here to celebrate. They were here to conduct an operation. David's Special Forces training automatically began cataloging details that would have been invisible to civilian security, but were unmistakable to someone with his background. The 3 men were positioned at strategic points around the ballroom that would allow them to control access points and establish fields of fire. They were wearing evening wear that appeared appropriate for the occasion, but David's experienced eye noted the telltale signs of concealed weapons. The slight bulge of shoulder holsters, the way their jackets hung to accommodate hardware, the careful way they moved to avoid revealing the outlines of tactical equipment. Most importantly, they were conducting what appeared to be final reconnaissance, mentally mapping the venue and identifying key personnel with the kind of methodical precision that suggested extensive planning and preparation. David's assessment crystallized into tactical certainty when he observed one of the men photographing the ballroom's layout with his phone, while another conducted what appeared to be a communications check with someone outside the venue. This wasn't random criminal activity. This was a professional operation targeting what was probably one of the highest concentration gatherings of wealthy, influential people in the region. The bride's father alone was worth an estimated $2.8 billion, and the guest list read like a who's who of American political and economic power. David understood, with the clarity that comes from extensive experience in threat assessment and target analysis, that he was looking at the opening phase of what was probably a kidnapping operation, targeting multiple high-value individuals. And there were 300 innocent people in the ballroom who had no idea that their lives were about to become collateral damage in a criminal enterprise that had been planned with military precision. David's first instinct was to find the venue's security coordinator and report what he'd observed. He located Marcus Williams, the head of security for the Chateau Marmont Resort, near the main entrance where he was coordinating with local law enforcement, who were providing perimeter security for the high-profile event. "Mr. Williams," David said, his voice carrying the controlled urgency of someone who understood exactly how serious the situation was. "I need to speak with you about a potential security threat. We have 3 individuals in the ballroom who are conducting reconnaissance for what appears to be a coordinated hostile operation." Williams looked at the catering server who was reporting suspicious activity with a mixture of professional interest and barely concealed skepticism. As head of security for a luxury resort that catered to celebrities and politicians, Williams dealt with paranoid reports from staff members on a regular basis, usually cases of mistaken identity or overactive imaginations that saw threats where none existed. "David, right?" Williams said, his tone patient but dismissive. "Look, I appreciate that you're being observant, but we've got extensive security protocols in place for this event. If there was a real threat, our systems would have detected it." "Sir, you don't understand," David pressed, his voice taking on the command presence he had learned when briefing superior officers on mission-critical intelligence. "These aren't random party crashers. They're conducting final operational preparations for what looks like a kidnapping or hostage situation. They've positioned themselves to control the ballroom's access points, and they're carrying concealed weapons." Williams's expression shifted from patience to condescension. "David, I appreciate that you think you know something about security, but I've got 20 years of experience in executive protection and event security. Our background checks cleared everyone on the guest list, and we've got plainclothes officers positioned throughout the venue." David felt the familiar frustration of being dismissed because of assumptions about his background and expertise. But this wasn't about wounded pride or professional recognition. This was about 300 innocent people who were about to become victims of a criminal operation that he was uniquely qualified to prevent. "Mr. Williams," David said, his voice taking on the deadly calm he had used when reporting imminent threats to operational command. "I'm former Army Special Forces with 10 years of experience in counterterrorism and threat assessment. I know what pre-operational surveillance looks like, and I'm telling you that we have hostiles in the venue who are about to initiate some kind of direct action." The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of preconceptions being challenged. Williams stared at the man he had thought of as catering staff, trying to process information that didn't fit his assumptions about service workers and military backgrounds. You're Special Forces?" "Former Staff Sergeant, 1st Special Forces Group," David replied. 4 combat deployments and extensive experience with hostage rescue and counterterrorism operations. The 3 men I've identified aren't here to celebrate. They're here to take hostages, and they're going to move soon. But even as Williams struggled to reconcile David's background with his assumptions, his institutional training in liability and protocol prevented him from acting on intelligence that contradicted established security procedures. "Even if that's true, I can't just disrupt a high-profile event based on one person's assessment. I need to verify this through proper channels." "There's no time for proper channels," David said, his voice carrying the urgency of someone who had seen how quickly peaceful situations could turn deadly. "I'm going to position myself where I can observe these individuals and intercept if necessary." "You will not," Williams said sharply, his authority challenged and his professional reputation on the line. "You're catering staff. You're not authorized to take any kind of security action. If you interfere with event operations, you'll be removed from the premises immediately." David looked at the man who was about to let protocol and prejudice turn a wedding into a bloodbath, and made a decision that would define the next several hours. He was going to do what Special Forces operators do when civilian authority fails to recognize imminent threats. He was going to complete the mission regardless of official permission. At exactly 8:47 p.m., as the bride and groom were preparing to cut their wedding cake, and the orchestra was playing a romantic waltz that had been specially arranged for the occasion, David's tactical assessment proved correct. The 3 men moved simultaneously, with the coordinated precision of a military unit executing a planned operation. They produced weapons from concealed carry positions and began shouting commands with practiced authority while positioning themselves to control the ballroom's exits and establish fields of fire that would prevent resistance or escape. "Everybody on the ground, now!" The leader's voice boomed through the elegant ballroom, his assault rifle sweeping across the crowd of wedding guests who had been laughing and dancing moments before. "This is a kidnapping. Cooperate and nobody dies." The reaction among the wedding guests was exactly what the kidnappers expected: shock, terror, and compliance from people who had never faced violence and had no training or experience for handling armed criminals. Designer gowns pooled on marble floors as society matrons dropped beside investment bankers who had never imagined that their wealth and privilege could make them targets rather than protectors. The bride screamed and clutched her new husband, while the groom tried to shield her with his body despite having no idea how to actually protect anyone from professional criminals with military-grade weapons. But in the corner of the ballroom, behind a serving station where he had positioned himself to maintain visual contact with all 3 suspects, David Rodriguez was making very different calculations. He was assessing sight lines, cover positions, and weapon capabilities, while his mind automatically shifted into the combat mode that had kept him alive through 4 deployments in hostile territory. The kidnappers had made several tactical errors that David recognized immediately. They had failed to identify and neutralize potential threats among the venue staff. They were positioned in ways that limited their ability to respond to attacks from multiple directions, and most importantly, they had assumed that everyone in the ballroom was helpless. "We know exactly who's here tonight," the leader continued, pressing his rifle against the head of Robert Pemberton III, while his partners began zip-tying the hands of high-value targets they had identified from photographs and intelligence gathering. Billionaires, politicians, defense contractors. You people are worth more than most countries' GDP, and you're going to make us very rich. David's assessment of the situation continued with the methodical precision of a professional warrior conducting mission planning under pressure. The kidnappers were focused on controlling and processing their primary targets and hadn't established proper security for the rest of the venue. They were assuming that wedding guests and catering staff represented no threat and required no special attention. They had failed to establish overwatch positions or designate anyone to monitor for law enforcement response. All of these were mistakes that David could exploit, but only if he could neutralize 3 armed professionals without endangering the 300 innocent people who were caught in the crossfire. As the kidnapping operation continued, and the criminals began selecting specific individuals for extraction to what was presumably a secure location where ransom demands could be made, David made a decision that would either save lives or get everyone in the ballroom killed. For the first time in 4 years, he was going to stop pretending to be a harmless service worker and remember what it felt like to be a Green Beret. Moving with the silent precision that had allowed him to infiltrate terrorist compounds undetected, David used his knowledge of the ballroom's layout to access a service corridor that ran behind the main event space. His movements were economical and calculated, each step designed to bring him closer to tactical advantage while remaining invisible to the kidnappers who were focused on their primary mission. In the service area, David's hands closed around improvised weapons that felt familiar despite the years away from combat. A heavy-duty serving knife that could function as a close-quarters combat blade, and a weighted serving tray that could serve as both impact weapon and defensive shield. They weren't the precision instruments he had once used to eliminate high-value targets, but in the hands of someone who understood how to weaponize any available tool, they would be sufficient. The first kidnapper never saw him coming. David emerged from the service corridor behind the ballroom's orchestra platform with the predatory silence of a ghost, his movements flowing with the deadly efficiency that had made him one of the most effective operators in his unit. The weighted serving tray connected with the base of the gunman's skull with exactly the right amount of force, enough to render him unconscious instantly, not enough to cause permanent injury. The terrorist dropped without a sound, his weapon clattering to the marble floor. The second kidnapper turned at the sound, his face showing confusion and disbelief as he tried to process what he was seeing. A man in catering uniform had somehow appeared behind his partner and neutralized a professional operator with what appeared to be a serving tray. "What the hell?" he began, but David was already moving. Years of close-quarters combat training erupted from dormancy as David used the gunman's moment of confusion to close distance and apply the improvised blade to the carotid artery with surgical precision. The cut was non-lethal, but immediately incapacitating, designed to cause unconsciousness through controlled blood loss rather than death. Within seconds, the second kidnapper was unconscious, and David was securing both weapons while maintaining visual contact with the ballroom to track the third hostile. But the leader of the kidnapping operation had heard the commotion and was moving toward the disturbance with his rifle ready, and Robert Pemberton III as a human shield. When he reached the orchestra platform and saw his 2 partners unconscious with a catering server kneeling beside them holding their weapons, his face went through a series of expressions that David had seen before on the faces of enemy combatants, who suddenly realized they had underestimated their opposition. "Drop the weapons, pretty boy," the leader said, pressing his rifle harder against Pemberton's head while backing toward the ballroom's main exit. "I don't know how you took down my team, but it doesn't matter. You shoot me, I kill the billionaire. You try anything stupid, I kill him and as many others as I can before you stop me." David looked at the man who was threatening to execute innocent people and felt something he hadn't experienced since leaving the army. The cold, analytical calm that had once made him one of the most effective killers in the Special Forces community. This wasn't just about stopping a kidnapping anymore. This was about eliminating a threat to people under his protection, and David Rodriguez had never failed to complete that kind of mission. "Son," David said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that comes from absolute confidence in one's abilities. "You've made 2 mistakes tonight. First, you assumed that being a waiter makes me harmless. Second, you threatened innocent people that I'm sworn to protect." The kidnapper's grip on his hostage tightened as he tried to maintain control of a situation that was rapidly deteriorating beyond his understanding. "I don't care what you think you are, hero. One more step and I put a bullet in this old man's head. Then I start working my way through the wedding guests until you decide to be reasonable." David's response was to do something that no civilian would ever consider in a hostage situation, but that made perfect tactical sense to someone with his background and training. He raised one of the captured rifles and fired a single shot, with the kind of precision that comes only from years of experience with weapons and an understanding of ballistics that borders on supernatural. The bullet passed within inches of Pemberton's head and struck the kidnapper in the shoulder with exactly enough force to spin him away from his hostage and disable his weapon arm without killing him. The shot placement was surgical, designed to neutralize the threat while preserving both the hostage's safety and the criminal's life for interrogation purposes. As the leader collapsed, clutching his wounded shoulder and screaming in pain and shock, Robert Pemberton III stumbled away from his captor with tears of relief streaming down his face. Around the ballroom, wedding guests who had been cowering in terror were now staring at David Rodriguez with expressions of awe and complete disbelief. The quiet catering server they had barely noticed for the entire evening had just executed what looked like something from a military operation. But David wasn't finished. With the same methodical efficiency he had used to neutralize terrorist cells in hostile territory, he applied field dressings to the leader's wound to prevent excessive blood loss, then used zip ties from his catering kit to secure all 3 kidnappers. Only then did he activate his phone to contact law enforcement and medical personnel. "This is David Rodriguez at the Chateau Marmont Resort," he said, his voice as calm as if he were taking a room service order. "We've had an attempted kidnapping at the Pemberton wedding. 3 suspects are secured and disarmed, one with a non-life-threatening gunshot wound. We need police response and an ambulance, but the immediate threat has been neutralized." As sirens began wailing in the distance and FBI agents who had been monitoring the high-profile event arrived to take over the scene, the story of what had happened began to spread through the ballroom and then through the exclusive social networks that connected America's wealthiest families. The catering server, who had been invisible to them for hours, had just saved their lives with a level of skill and competence that exceeded anything they had seen outside of Hollywood movies. But it was the conversation with FBI Special Agent Sarah Chen that would reveal the full scope of who David Rodriguez really was. Agent Chen had arrived expecting to investigate a kidnapping attempt, but what she found was a tactical situation that had been resolved with a level of precision and efficiency that suggested extensive military training and combat experience. "Mr. Rodriguez," Agent Chen said, as she reviewed the scene and interviewed witnesses, "what you accomplished here tonight, that wasn't luck or adrenaline. That was professional-level counterterrorism work. Can you tell me about your background?" David looked at the federal agent who was trying to understand how a catering server had single-handedly neutralized a coordinated kidnapping operation, and decided it was time to stop hiding who he really was. "I'm former Staff Sergeant David Rodriguez, 1st Special Forces Group, United States Army. 4 combat deployments and 10 years of experience in direct action, counterterrorism, and hostage rescue operations." Agent Chen's expression changed as she began to understand the implications of what she was hearing. "Special Forces, Green Beret. What was your operational history?" "Classified," David replied matter-of-factly. "But I can tell you that I've planned and executed missions against high-value targets in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria. Tonight's operation was textbook hostage rescue, adapted for a civilian environment with minimal collateral damage." The silence that followed was heavy with respect and understanding. Agent Chen was looking at a warrior whose military service had probably prevented terrorist attacks and saved American lives in operations that would never be publicly acknowledged. "Mr. Rodriguez," she said finally, "your service record, your capabilities. Why have you been working catering events instead of using these skills in law enforcement or security?" David shrugged, a gesture that carried the weight of years of being overlooked because of assumptions about background and education. Because explaining Special Forces experience to civilian employers often leads to more questions than job offers. Because some people see a Hispanic veteran with medical discharge papers and make assumptions about stability and reliability. Because sometimes it's easier to be invisible than to constantly prove that your unconventional background has value in conventional settings. Agent Chen nodded, understanding beginning to dawn. "The precision you showed tonight, neutralizing 3 armed professionals without killing any of them, that's not something most law enforcement officers could accomplish under those conditions." "Agent Chen," David replied, "I spent 10 years learning how to eliminate threats while minimizing collateral damage and preserving intelligence assets for interrogation. Tonight was a controlled environment with clear fields of fire and non-combatant separation. The only difference between this and my previous work was that tonight I was protecting people I cared about instead of advancing strategic objectives." As the investigation concluded and the 3 kidnappers were taken into federal custody, David Rodriguez found himself back where he had started, a catering server in a black uniform whose heroic actions were already being processed into official reports and insurance claims. But everything had changed. The wedding guests who had survived the kidnapping attempt would never again look at David Rodriguez and see just the help. They had seen him coordinate a hostage rescue operation with the kind of technical expertise and unflappable courage that most of them couldn't comprehend, regardless of their wealth or social status. They had depended on his skills, trusted his judgment, and survived because of his willingness to take action when official security failed. Robert Pemberton III, whose life had been saved by the man his family had treated as invisible help, approached David later that evening with an offer that reflected his new understanding of what constituted real value in an employee. "David, I want you to come work for Pemberton Industries as our Director of Executive Protection and Security Operations. Your experience, your skills, your ability to perform under pressure, those are capabilities that no amount of money can buy." David looked at the man who was offering him a position that would change his life, provide financial security, and give him the kind of professional recognition that he had never expected to receive in civilian life. "Mr. Pemberton, I appreciate the offer, but I'm not sure I'm ready for that level of responsibility again. Tonight brought back a lot of memories that I've spent years trying to manage." His voice carried the weight of someone who had carried too much responsibility for other people's lives during years when the stakes were measured in national security rather than corporate profits. "But your abilities," Pemberton pressed. "What you did tonight. You saved not just my life, but the lives of everyone in that ballroom. You deserve to be in a position where those skills are recognized and compensated appropriately." David was quiet for a long moment, considering how much of his story he was willing to share with someone who had spent the evening learning that assumptions about social hierarchy might be dangerously wrong. "Mr. Pemberton, for 10 years I was responsible for missions where failure meant that American soldiers died and terrorist operations succeeded. When I left the Army, I thought I was ready to step back from that kind of pressure. Tonight reminded me that some responsibilities never really go away. They just wait for the right moment to resurface." As David Rodriguez finished cleaning up the ballroom and preparing to leave the Chateau Marmont resort, he reflected on how much had changed in a single evening. Tomorrow, he would probably still be working catering events at Colorado's luxury venues. He would still serve champagne and clear dinner plates for people who lived in a different economic universe. But now those people would understand that he was someone special. Someone whose presence made their exclusive gatherings safer just by being there. More importantly, David had been reminded that his training and experience hadn't become worthless when he left the army. Every day that he went to work, every time he used his situational awareness and tactical thinking to prevent problems or respond to emergencies, he was still serving others. He was still protecting people, just in a different uniform. And when the moment demanded it, when 300 innocent people needed protection from professional criminals who had planned their operation with military precision, Staff Sergeant David Rodriguez had been ready to step forward and do what Green Berets do: assess the threat, plan the mission, and execute with surgical precision regardless of the odds. Because some skills are too valuable to lose, and some people are too dangerous to overlook, whether high society recognizes their worth or not.